Welcome to BeFM Drama. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and all this week we're presenting our 5-part adaptation of The Greek Interpreter, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A conversation between Sherlock Holmes and his friend and chronicler, Dr. John Watson, has led to a memorable first meeting with Mycroft Holmes, the detective's older brother. A man with observational powers of deduction as great, if not greater, than those of his younger brother, but one who is nonetheless crippled by a distinctive lack of energy and an overriding apathy towards the intricacies of criminal investigation and legal proceedings. The meeting with Mycroft Holmes in the strange Diogenes club where he spends his free time has taken an interesting turn as the detective's older brother moves to introduce a neighbor of his to Holmes. A neighbor with an interesting and troubling story to tell. Mycroft Holmes scribbled a note upon a leaf of his pocketbook, and ringing the bell, he handed it to the waiter. A few minutes later, we were joined by a short, stout man whose olive face and coal-black hair proclaimed his southern origin, though his speech was that of an educated Englishman. Mycroft introduced him to us as a Mr. Melas, a neighbor of his with occasional business in the same ministries where Mycroft plied his trade. Mycroft told us that Mr. Melas was Greek by birth, a brilliant linguist who made his living partly as an interpreter for the law courts and partly by acting as a guide to any Greek or Ottoman citizen who might need the assistance of an interpreter in their visit to London. Melas shook hands eagerly with Sherlock Holmes, and his dark eyes sparkled with pleasure when he understood that the detective was eager to hear his story. He spoke quickly to us in his lively, unaccented way.
I do not believe that the police believe me at all. On my word, I do not. Just because they have never heard of such a thing happening before. They believe it cannot be. But I know that I shall never be easy in my mind until I know what has become of that poor starving man I met with the sticking plasters all over his face.
With that, Melas launched himself into the tale, to which the three of us listened with rapt attention. I've done my best to recreate it here from memory, endeavoring to capture the full ebb and flow of the story as it was laid out before us. It began on Monday evening, just 2 days earlier. Melas was an interpreter, as I have mentioned. He interpreted many languages, but since he was Greek first and foremost, with a Grecian name, it was with that language that he was most closely associated. For many years, he had been the most desired and often called upon Greek interpreter in London, and his name was very well known in all the big hotels where wealthy Greek visitors were liable to stay. Given the nature of his work, it was not uncommon for Mr. Melas to be called for at odd hours by foreigners who had gotten themselves into difficulties, or by travelers who had arrived late and exhausted and desperately in need of the services of a good interpreter and the comfort of a fellow countryman. And so Melas was not surprised at all on Monday night when a man calling himself Mr. Latimer, a very fashionably dressed young fellow, called up to his rooms and asked him to accompany him in a cab which was waiting by the door. A Greek friend had come to see him upon business, Latimer told him, and since the man could speak nothing but his own Greek, the services of an interpreter were sorely needed. Latimer let him understand that his house was some ways off, in Kensington, and he seemed to be in a great hurry, bustling Melas rapidly into the cab once they had descended to the street. Here, Melas paused with a thoughtful expression on his face.
I say it was a cab, but I soon became doubtful as to whether or not it was actually a private carriage we rode in. It was certainly roomier than the ordinary four-wheeled disgrace to London, and the fittings, though frayed, were of good quality.
Holmes nodded approvingly at this observation, leaning forward on the coffee table with his chin in his hands, listening in rapt attention as the interpreter continued his story. Mr. Latimer was seated opposite Melas as they started off through Charing Cross and up Shaftesbury Avenue. They came out upon Oxford Street, and Melas looked around with some growing concern.
This is an awfully roundabout way to get to Kensington.
Within a moment of the interpreter saying these words, he found himself frozen and dismayed by the extraordinary behavior of his young companion. Latimer began by drawing an evil-looking weighted club from under his coat, a lead-loaded bludgeon of the kind favored by petty criminals and thugs all over London. He swung it backwards and forwards several times, as if testing its deadly weight and strength. Then he put it without a word upon the seat between him and Melas. Having done this, he reached over and closed the carriage window, first on Melas's side, then on his, leaving the now terrified interpreter without any view of the outside at all.
I'm sorry to cut off your view, Mr. Melas. The fact is that I have no intention whatsoever that you should see what the place that we are driving to. It might possibly be inconvenient for me if you could find your way back there again.
As you can imagine, Melas was utterly taken aback by such an address. His companion was a powerful, broad-shouldered young man, and even without the weapon, there was no way that Melas would have ever had the slightest chance against him if it came down to a fight.
This is very extraordinary conduct, Mr. Latimer. You must be aware that what you are doing is quite illegal.
We're taking some liberty with the law, certainly. But don't worry, we'll make it up to you. But I must warn you, Mr. Melas, that if at any time tonight you attempt to raise the alarm or do anything at all which is against my desires, you'll find it a very unpleasant thing indeed. I beg you, please remember that no one knows where you are. Whether you are in this carriage or in my house, you are completely in my power. And I'm not a man who takes kindly to disobedience in my employees.
His words were quiet, but he had a rasping way of saying them which was far more threatening than the weighted bludgeon sitting on the seat beside him. Melas sat in silence, wondering what on earth could be Latimer's reason for kidnapping him in this extraordinary fashion. Whatever it might be, it was perfectly clear that there was no possible use in his resisting, and that he could only wait to see what might happen next. They drove for nearly 2 hours without the interpreter having any sense at all of where they were going. Sometimes the rattle of the stones told him that they were driving on a paved causeway, and at other times the smooth, silent whish of the wheels suggested that they were traveling on asphalt. Except for these variations in sound, there was nothing at all that could in any way help Melas to guess where it was that they were going. The covers on each window were impenetrable to light, and a blue curtain had been drawn close in front of them, furthering the interpreter's sense of being cut off from the world. It was 7:15 when they left his apartment at Pall Mall, and according to Melas's watch, it was 10 minutes to 9 when they came at last to a standstill. Latimer pulled back the curtain and opened the window shutters, and Melas caught a glimpse of a low, arched doorway with a lamp burning over it. As he was hurried from the carriage, the door swung open, and he found himself inside the house, with a vague impression of a lawn and trees on either side of him as he entered. Whether they were on private grounds in the city, or actually out in the honest-to-God countryside, was more than Melas could possibly guess. There was a colored gas lamp inside the hall, turned down so low that Melas could see very little, except that the hall was wide and hung with many pictures. In the dim light, he could make out that the person who had opened the door was a small, mean-looking, middle-aged man with rounded shoulders. As he turned towards him, the glint of light showed him that he was wearing glasses.
Is this Mr. Melas, Herald?
Yes.
Well done, well done. You hold no ill will towards us, I hope, Mr. Melas. I'm sorry to resort to such methods, but we could not possibly get on without you. If you deal fairly with us, you'll not regret it. But if you try any tricks, God help you, Mr. Melas, God help you.
He spoke in a nervous, jerky fashion, with little high, giggling laughs in between. But somehow he filled the interpreter with a fear far greater than what he felt in the presence of Latimer, regardless of the younger man's physical bulk and leaded bludgeon.
What do you want with me?
Only to ask a few questions of a Greek gentleman who is visiting us, and to let us have the answers, but say no more than you are told to say, or you had better never have been born.
And then the man was laughing again, his awful, rising, manic giggle filling the hallway as he led the terrified interpreter deeper into that mysterious house. And with that, we've come to the end of part 2 in our 5-part adaptation of this gripping tale from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. What will Mr. Melas, the terrified Greek interpreter, find as he makes his way deeper into that house? And what strange job do his captors have in store for him? Find out tomorrow evening when you rejoin us here for the next exciting installment of BeFM Drama. From our studio here in Busan, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell.